Look, I have nothing against electric vehicles. If people want to zip around in silent little spaceships, that's their business. But when my HOA decided they needed to bulldoze my barn, to make room for a shiny new EV charging station, that's where I drew the line. For context, I own a decent chunk of land on the outskirts of our neighborhood, which up until recently, had been mostly left alone. My grandfather built the barn decades ago, and while it's not exactly a structural masterpiece, it's a piece of family history. Also, I use it for storage, woodworking, and occasionally, hiding from HOA board meetings. But apparently, my land was now prime real estate for their green initiative, and the HOA, led by our ever-delightful president Marjorie Klein, had decided that my barn had to go. It all started with a letter. You know the kind, thick envelope, HOA letterhead, and enough legalese to make a Supreme Court justice cry. Dear homeowner, in accordance with the new HOA initiative for sustainable energy infrastructure, we are pleased to inform you that your property has been selected as the ideal site for the construction of a public electric vehicle charging station. This decision was made after a thorough review, considering accessibility, location, and potential for community enrichment. Construction is scheduled to begin in 4 weeks. Please vacate any personal belongings from the structure in question before demolition. Thank you for your cooperation and commitment to a greener future. Sincerely, Marjorie Klein, HOA President. They really went with pleased to inform you, like they were gifting me a new TV instead of announcing the unilateral destruction of my barn. After reading the letter, and briefly considering setting it on fire, I showed up at the next HOA meeting. These were usually held at the community clubhouse, a building that looked like someone tried to recreate a country club using only beige paint and despair. I walked in and immediately locked eyes with Marjorie. She had the expression of someone who just found out a commoner had dared to address her directly. Before I could even open my mouth, she raised a hand. Ah, Mr. Carter. I assume you're here about the charging station. Oh, you mean the barn bulldozing project? Yeah, I had a few questions. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. She sighed dramatically. It's for the good of the community. So is my barn. Where exactly in the bylaws does it say you can seize private property for a charging station? We're not seizing it, she said, feigning patience. We're reallocating under our Community Improvement Clause. Ah, the dreaded Community Improvement Clause. A vague, often abused rule that let the HOA justify all kinds of nonsense, from forcing everyone to use the same mailbox design to banning garden gnomes for aesthetic consistency. Unfortunately for Marjorie, I'd actually read the bylaws. I see, I said, stroking my chin for effect. And does that clause override state property laws? Because last I checked, you can't just decide to repurpose someone else's land without their consent. Murmurs spread through the room. A few other homeowners, including my buddy Frank, shot me approving looks. Marjorie's left eye twitched, which I took as a sign of her processing the possibility that I wasn't going to roll over like a well-trained HOA poodle. A week later, I got a second letter. This one was much less pleased to inform me, and much more do what we say or else. Dear Mr. Carter, your refusal to cooperate with the Sustainable Energy Initiative has been noted. If you do not comply with the planned demolition, the HOA will pursue further action, including fines for non-compliance with the Community Improvement Plan. Oh, they wanted a fight. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I started digging. I spent the next week poring over property laws, county zoning regulations, and the HOA own bylaws. And that's when I found my golden ticket. See, the HOA authority did not extend to any structure predating the HOA itself, which my barn did. In legal terms, it was considered a grandfathered structure, meaning they couldn't touch it without my permission. I could have stopped there, but where's the fun in that? I had another idea. One that would turn the tables spectacularly. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in carrying a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. Marjorie barely concealed her irritation. You again, she muttered. Me again, I confirmed. So, about my barn. She rolled her eyes. Mr. Carter, the matter has been settled. Oh, I agree, I interrupted, dropping the folder onto the table with a thud. And that's why I'm here to announce my own improvement project. Marjorie frowned. What? I've been inspired by your commitment to community improvement, I said, barely keeping a straight face. So I've decided to apply for my own development permit. Her eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws, flipped to a specific page, and read aloud. Homeowners are permitted to propose their own community enhancement projects, provided they align with existing zoning laws and receive at least 25% neighborhood approval. I smiled. I already have 40% of the neighborhood on board. And according to the county zoning laws, I can legally register my barn as a historical landmark due to its age and original structure. Marjorie paled. That's. And because of its landmark status, I continued, enjoying this way too much, I'm also eligible for a state grant to restore it. Which means not only can you not tear it down, but the HOA might actually have to help fund its maintenance. Silence. Beautiful, glorious silence. Frank coughed into his hand to hide a laugh. One of the other board members cleared his throat. If Mr. Carter's structure is officially recognized as a landmark, then it would be protected under state law. Marjorie's eye twitched so hard I thought she might develop a medical condition on the spot. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. So when should we start talking about my barn restoration grant? The silence in that HOA meeting stretched on so long you could have measured it with a sundial. Marjorie's face did this incredible thing where it went through 5 different shades of red, like a malfunctioning stoplight. This is unacceptable, she finally spat out. Actually, I said, tapping my copy of the bylaws, it's entirely acceptable, unless you want to argue that the HOA own rules don't apply to me. A few of the board members exchanged nervous glances. Marjorie's whole shtick was enforcing the rules with the cold precision of a medieval tax collector, and now I had just used those very rules to pants her in front of the whole neighborhood. One of the other members, Ron, cleared his throat. If Mr. Carter's barn meets the historical criteria, then we can't move forward with the demolition. Marjorie snapped her head toward him like he had personally betrayed her. Ron, we discussed this. The charging station is a community priority. Ron swallowed hard and adjusted his glasses. We also agreed to follow proper protocol. That was my cue. Speaking of protocol, I said, pulling out another document, I've already filed for my historic landmark application with the county. Should be approved within the next few weeks. Oh, and fun fact, since it's now pending approval, the barn is already protected under the temporary landmark designation. So legally, you can't touch it. A few muffled chuckles from the other homeowners rippled through the room. Marjorie looked like she wanted to breathe fire. This is ridiculous. You're standing in the way of progress. I shrugged. Funny, I thought I was standing in the way of you bulldozing my property. Easy to get those confused, I guess. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Fine, she hissed. We'll see what the county says about this. I knew Marjorie wasn't just going to take the loss and move on. That woman held grudges like a corrupt sheriff in an old Western movie. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got another letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't about demolishing my barn, it was a code violation notice. Dear Mr. Carter, upon recent inspection, your property has been found in violation of several HOA regulations, including excessive vegetation growth, unapproved exterior modifications to existing structures, improper storage of materials. Failure to correct these issues within 7 days will result in escalating fines. The classic HOA retaliation move, nitpicking nonsense violations. I grabbed my phone and texted my buddy Frank, who had been watching all of this unfold with the same level of enthusiasm as a man seeing his rival trip over a curb. Me, guess who just got slapped with 3 bogus violations? Frank, LMAO, she's mad. Me, time to fight dirty? Frank, oh hell yes. What's the plan? If Marjorie wanted to play the technically, it's in the rules game, I was more than happy to play it better. Step 1. Enforce every HOA rule on them. I spent the next few hours combing through the entire HOA rulebook. And let me tell you, these people were violating their own regulations left and right. Marjorie's own house had an unapproved fence color. It was a shade too dark. Ron had a decorative windmill in his front yard, which was technically classified as a prohibited lawn ornament. The HOA clubhouse itself was overdue for an exterior repaint per their own maintenance guidelines. Step 2. File complaints. All of them. By the next morning, I had filed 15 separate official complaints against various HOA board members and properties. And per their own rules, each complaint had to be reviewed individually at the next meeting. Marjorie's own fence was now under investigation. But the real masterstroke came when I found an obscure rule stating that any property designated for a public use project must first receive approval from at least 51% of homeowners in a formal vote. You see where this is going, right? At the next HOA meeting, Marjorie looked exhausted. Probably because she had spent the past week dealing with an avalanche of petty violations from her own rules. "Mr. Carter," she said through gritted teeth, "would you care to explain why you've been harassing the board with complaints?" I leaned back in my chair. "Just making sure the rules are enforced fairly, Marjorie. You do believe in fair enforcement, don't you?" Before she could explode, I hit her with the finishing blow. "Oh, and by the way," I added casually, "turns out the EV charging station project never actually got the required 51% homeowner approval vote." Marjorie blinked. "What?" I pulled out the bylaw section and read it aloud. "Without majority homeowner approval, the HOA legally can't proceed with any major community development." She paled. We assumed it was covered under the improvement clause." I shook my head. "Nope. Explicit homeowner vote required. And since I just got a petition signed by 62% of the neighborhood opposing it, looks like your charging station is officially dead in the water." Frank let out a loud, satisfied whistle. Ron sighed and took off his glasses. "Well, damn. And that was that. My barn got its official historical landmark status, meaning the HOA could never touch it again." Marjorie resigned from the HOA 2 months later, citing personal reasons. Translation: she was sick of losing. The HOA stopped harassing me, probably because they realized I was willing to fight them harder than they were willing to fight me. Frank and I celebrated with a massive cookout, where the entire neighborhood showed up to roast Marjorie behind her back. Justice. Moral of the story: never assume an HOA knows their own rules. Because if they don't, someone like me definitely will.